Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2004 Ingersoll lecture on immortality. Actually, the original deed of gift that established the Ingersoll lectures, which was given by Miss Caroline Haskell Ingersoll in honor of her father in 1893, said it should be the lecture on the immortality of man. Now, that is obviously homo in the sense of the generic man, and it was certainly taken that way, I think, at that time. Although now I think there's discomfort with that as a generic term for humankind or for human beings. In any case, we are talking about Homo sapiens, I think, human beings, and about immortality tonight. And it's a great pleasure to have the distinguished scholar that we have. And in just a moment, he will be introduced to you by my colleague. Let me first just say one other word or two about the Ingersoll lectures. They were given in honor of Miss Ingersoll's father, George Goldthwait Ingersoll, who was himself not only a graduate of Harvard College in 1815 and of an MA program in 1818, but was also held an STD degree from this, a divinity degree from this institution within Harvard in 1845. And he served many years as a pastor throughout New England, dying in Keene, New Hampshire during the Civil War in 1863. So this is one of our most distinguished and oldest lectureships here in the school. It's one that it has had a spate of extremely distinguished predecessors, beginning with William James, the first Ingersoll lecturer, and going through people such as, just to name a few, Josiah Ross, George Foote Moore, George Lyman Kittredge, Alfred North Whitehead, Willard Sperry, Harry Wolfson, Vanna Yeager, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Victor Turner, Martin Marty, Caroline Bynum, Mary Douglas, Anna Marie Schimmel, Carol Zaleski, Wendy Doniger. There are many, many more in this list, but it gives you something of an idea of the variety of fields represented, as well as the variety of kinds of scholarship and approaches. And knowing what I do know about our speaker this evening and his work, you're in for another treat in this year's Ingersoll lecture. Without further ado, though, I'm going to call forward my colleague, the Hershey Professor of Buddhist Studies, Janet Gyatso. Janet, if you would come forward to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Donna Lopez, Carl W. Belser, Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan, who's going to deliver the Ingersoll lecture today on the immortality of the Buddha. Whether the Buddha is a Homo sapien or not, maybe we'll find out. Professor Lopez is a longtime colleague of mine, a friend, a collaborator in many projects, an absolutely leading force today in bringing the insights of cultural theory on post-Orientalism and postmodernism to the study of Buddhism and the study of Tibetan religion. He's famous in this regard for having received his education at what can be said to be one of the most traditional programs, perhaps the closest you can get to a seminary education in Tibetan studies in the United States at the University of Virginia, where he received all 3 degrees in religious studies, culminating in his PhD in 1982. While continuing to maintain his standing in that most philological and classical lineage throughout his very distinguished career, Donna Lopez has also moved very far from it to have a major role in spearheading the coming of age of Buddhist studies in the American Academy, as able to address and help think the new insights and approaches that have been percolating in the humanities over the last few decades. After some early and highly scholastic work on the Heart Sutra and also on the Swatantrika school of Buddhist philosophy, Donna Lopez edited an important collection for comparative work in the study of religion with Stephen Rockefeller in 1987, on the Christ and the Bodhisattva. This was followed soon by an even more groundbreaking edited collection on Buddhist hermeneutics, probably one of the first times that word was understood to be useful and appropriate to the understanding of Buddhist intellectual practices. Another edited collection that Professor Lopez published in 1995, Curators of the Buddha, has received an enormous amount of attention in Buddhist studies and has served to galvanize our awareness of the key role of colonialism in the study of Buddhism in particular. In that book, Professor Lopez's contribution, his own contribution, included a sustained and critical look at his relations with his Tibetan teachers, colleagues, informants, the competing power dynamics of which were not spared analysis regarding Lopez's own institutional affiliation and implication in an Orientalist heritage. In 1999, Professor Lopez published what was perhaps his most controversial work, Prisoners of Shangri-La, a bold study of the Orientalist representation of Tibet in the modern period, a representation that was appropriated and even exacerbated by the Tibetan community in exile itself. And at a widely attended review panel on that book at the American Academy of Religion that I happen to be the chair of, and was sitting between certain combative representatives of opposing views, who shall remain unnamed for now, the passions were running so high that I remember being glad that my chair had some well-oiled wheels on it in case I had to make a quick exit. Professor Lopez has had an incalculable influence on the development of academic Buddhist and Tibetan studies with his theoretical interventions, even while he has also carried on with a variety of historical and textual projects at the same time. Over the last few years, he has edited and published a wonderful series of anthologies on Asian religions across the board with Princeton University Press, in each of which he has endeavored to break out of normative notions of what constitutes the canon in each case, commissioning instead the translation of a wide range of genres of writing outside of circles of elite scholasticism in pre-modern Asia. Don Lopez has also recently published with Penguin Classics a new anthology of Buddhist scriptures, another groundbreaking collection called A Modern Buddhist Bible. He has forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press yet another new edited collection bound to be controversial and provocative again, entitled Critical Terms for the Study of Buddhism, which will be coming out early next year. I'm also looking forward to his study of Gindan Chumpel, a 20th century Tibetan Buddhist philosopher, controversial in his own right, which will conjoin Lopez's interest in philosophy with his ongoing work in cultural criticism. That book's entitled The Madman's Middle Way. That's also coming out with Chicago. And this guy does a lot of work. He also has another book coming out with Chicago entitled Buddhism and Science, A Historical Critique. Let me mention, by the way, before I close that Professor Lopez will be giving a second lecture tomorrow in the Buddhist Studies Forum. The lecture is entitled, and I assume ironically, Mahayana meets Hinayana, a Tibetan monk in Sri Lanka. And that will be tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. in the Barker Center. This is the Kresge room? Room 133, that's in the Humanities Center. Donald Lopez is always a treat to listen to, however provocative, and so let's enjoy now listening and thinking with him together. Welcome.
Thank you, Janet. I should say that I believe I met Janet Gyatso 20 years ago. Before we met in person, I was in contact with her by telephone about a panel at the American Academy of Religion. This was before email. And in the course of our conversation, Janet said to me, yes, I'm using your book on Swatantrika in my class at Amherst. I was absolutely dumbfounded to think that my dissertation, which had been turned into a book on an arcane and defunct school of Buddhist philosophy, was somehow being used as a textbook in a course at Amherst College. And Janet said, yes, you can even read it. And tears welled in my eyes at those words, and I've always fantasized that one day that book would be republished, and the fantasy is that it would be republished, and that on the back there would be a blurb that said, you can really read it. Janet Gyatso, Harvard University. So thank you, Janet. I should say at the outset, in the interest of full disclosure, that the meditations on the immortality of the Buddha that I will present this evening do not occur in a Buddhist sutra, but are instead my own, at least in some sense. I should also say that although it would certainly be more efficacious for me, and perhaps for you, if I were to perform these meditations by sitting silently for the next hour, I will in fact be speaking during that time. Those who have preceded me in delivering the Ingersoll lecture on immortality over the past century constitute a widely diverse but uniformly august company, as Dean Graham has just indicated, one that I am sincerely humbled to join. An endowed lecture is meant to bestow a certain immortality with funds provided by the donor to sponsor the lecture in perpetuity. It is thus probably appropriate for me to begin by speaking briefly about this particular form of immortality, which began in 1896. As one peruses the list of figures who have delivered the Ingersoll lecture over the years, one notices that the term Buddhism appears but once. Buddhism is indeed a tradition that we associate with mortality rather than immortality, with impermanence rather than permanence, and perhaps this accounts for the relative absence of Buddhism in the list. It was in the year 1908 that the title of the Ingersoll lecture was Buddhism and Immortality. The speaker was William Sturgis Bigelow. Those of you interested in Japanese art will surely know his name. He was one of the most prominent of the Boston Buddhists of the late 19th century, a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, a friend of Phillips Brooks, a student of Louis Pasteur, a friend and White House guest of Theodore Roosevelt. Bigelow gave up his medical practice in 1882 and traveled to Japan, where he would spend the next 7 years. He became a great patron and collector of Japanese art, providing much of the Japanese collection of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And he was also a Buddhist and received the Bodhisattva precepts in a ceremony at Mount Hiei outside Kyoto in 1888. Bigelow's Ingersoll lecture, however, only some 10,000 words in length, and I promise you mine will be somewhat shorter, appears to be his most substantial discussion of Buddhism. Here is how he began his lecture in 1908. The view of the immortality of man, which I have the privilege of stating, is, broadly speaking, that of the Buddhist religion. But Buddhism, like many other great religions, is divided into many churches and subdivided into sects. And we find conspicuously two principal divisions, commonly called Northern and Southern Buddhism, the former having its recognized center in the north of India, in Nepal, the latter in Ceylon. The history, the significance, and the relations of these two divisions constitute a vast field of study into which we cannot attempt to enter tonight. He goes on, what I have to say relates primarily to the Northern or Nepalese Buddhism, and more especially to the doctrines of the two closely allied sects which represent that form of Buddhism in Japan. These sects are known respectively as the Tendai and the Shingon. The whole of Northern Buddhism is nearly allied with Brahmanism, to which it is historically related. There is a close resemblance in the tenets and doctrines of the two religions, even in their superficial aspects, and the more deeply they are studied, the closer is the connection found to be. The forms of religious service are essentially the same in both. And even in Japan today, the great part of the Shingon and Tendai ritual is not in Japanese but in Sanskrit, and is identical with that which has been in use in India since before the time of the Buddha. So long before, in fact, that there is no historic record of its origin, and there is reason to believe that it antedates written history altogether. It certainly appears to be the oldest ritual now in actual use in the world. One of the themes I will try to consider this evening is the possible relation between immortality and what we call academic progress. Thus, one might ask what a modern-day scholar of Buddhism would make of these confident claims a century later. We note that Bigelow employs the distinction, since abandoned, between Northern and Southern Buddhism, and explains, following Brian Hodgson's erroneous lead, that Northern Buddhism is somehow based in Nepal. At the same time, Bigelow clearly resists the Theravada hegemony that ruled his day, which saw the Buddhism of Ceylon as the true preserve of the Buddha's original teachings. Furthermore, Bigelow is avant-garde in not confining his interest to Buddhist philosophy, but considering also its ritual forms, claiming, as few would in his day, but as many would now, that they derive from ancient India. Perhaps sadly, this sign of promise from our perspective is not fulfilled in the remainder of the lecture, where no Buddhist text, northern or southern, is cited, and where even the name of the Buddha is not mentioned. We find instead a rather psychologized version of Emersonian philosophy. And the 1908 lecture concludes with these words: "Deeper than the kingdoms, higher than the stars, is the sky that holds them all, and there alone is peace, that peace which the material world cannot give, that peace which passeth understanding trained on material things, infinite and eternal peace, the peace of limitless consciousness unified with limitless will, the peace of nirvana." Knowing what we now know, it seems that Dr. Bigelow, like the gurus of the Gautama prince, was not describing nirvana, but merely the second level of the formless realm. But let us now turn to that prince who would become the Buddha. In order to meditate on his immortality, however, it is first necessary to identify him, and that is a difficult task. Among the many ways that he could be described, this is what someone has said. There was born in a family of Kshatriyas, that of the Shakyas of Kapilavastu, who claimed to descend from the ancient solar race of India, a young prince who, renouncing the world at the age of 29, became a monk under the name of Shakyamuni or Shramana Gautama. His doctrine, which according to the sutras was more moral than metaphysical, at least in principle, rested upon a view accepted as fact and upon a hope presented as certitude. This view is that the visible world is in perpetual change, that death succeeds life and life death, that humans, like all that surrounds them, revolve in an eternal circle of transmigration, that they successively pass through all forms of life, from the most elementary to the most perfect, that the place they occupy in the vast scale of living beings depends on the merit of the actions they perform in this world, and thus the virtuous person must, after this life, be reborn with a divine body, and the sinner with the body of the damned, that the rewards of heaven and the punishments of hell have only a limited duration, that everything that is in the world, like everything that is in the world, that time exhausts the merit of virtuous actions as it effaces the faults of evil actions, and that the fatal law of change brings both the God and the damned back to earth in order to again put both to the test and make them pass through a new series of transformations. The hope that Shakyamuni brought was the possibility to escape from the law of transmigration, entering into what he calls nirvana, that is to say, annihilation. The definitive sign of this annihilation was death, but a preliminary sign in this life announced the person predestined for this supreme liberation. It was the possession of an unlimited knowledge, which provided a clear view of the world as it is, that is to say, the understanding of the physical and moral laws, and in a word, it was the practice of the six transcendent perfections, that of charity, ethics, wisdom, energy, patience, and benevolence. The authority upon which the monk of the Shakya race supported his teaching was entirely personal. It was formed of two elements, one real, the other ideal. The first was the consistency and the saintliness of his conduct, of which chastity, patience, and charity formed the principal features. The second was the claim he made to be Buddha, that is to say, enlightened, and as such to possess superhuman knowledge and power. With his power, he performed miracles. With his wisdom, he perceived in a form both clear and complete the past and the future. Through that, he could recount everything that each person had done in their previous existences. And so he affirmed that an infinite number of beings had long ago attained, like him, through the practice of the same virtues, the rank of Buddha, before also entering into complete annihilation. In the end, he offered himself to humanity as its savior, and he promised that his death will not annihilate his doctrine, but that his doctrine should endure for a great number of centuries after him, and that when his salutary action will have ceased, there would come into the world a new Buddha, whom he announced by name, and whom, before descending to earth, the legends say, he himself had crowned in heaven with the title of future Buddha. This is the view of the Buddha and of his teaching that would be most widely accepted during the long centuries of Buddhism in India, and which remains the view of the Buddha in the Theravada, what Dr. Bigelow called Southern Buddhism. Here we see the end of the Buddhist path not to be immortality, but rather mortality. The goal of the practice after birth and rebirth without beginning is once and for all to die and never be reborn. That is the fate and the achievement of the Buddha himself. The Buddha passes into the death that is nirvana. His teachings, his dharma, and his vinaya, however, survive him. But this view of the Buddha's identity and of his life did not go uncontested. Many alternative visions might be cited. This evening, let me mention only one. At the beginning of the 15th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the earth splits open and innumerable bodhisattvas emerge to pay homage to the Buddha. The Buddha explains that these are all his disciples, in whom he has inspired bodhicitta, the aspiration to enlightenment, and whom he has instructed of the long path of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva Manjushri witnesses all this and, speaking for us all, asks the obvious question. When the Tathagata was a crown prince, he left the palace of the Shakyas, sat on the terrace of enlightenment, which is not far from the city of Gaya, and attained highest enlightenment. Since then, no more than 40 years have passed. How is it possible, O Bhagavat, for you to have done such great Buddha acts in such a short period of time? Is it through the might of the Buddha and through the Buddha's qualities that you have inspired such an assembly of incalculable great bodhisattvas to achieve the highest enlightenment? Suppose a handsome man with dark hair, Maitreya continues, 25 years of age, were to point to a 100-year-old man and say, "This is my son." And the 100-year-old man points to the young fellow and says, "He is the father who raised me." This would be difficult to believe. And what the Buddha has now taught is exactly like this. It has not, in fact, been so long since the Buddha attained the path. Yet for the sake of the Buddha path, this great assembly of bodhisattvas has been diligently striving for innumerable thousands of kotis of kalpas. We believe the Buddha's words, spoken according to our capacities, and that what he says is never false. We are all well versed in the Buddha's knowledge. However, if the bodhisattvas in whom the thought of enlightenment has recently awakened hear this, after the Buddha's parinirvana, they will not accept it. And this will bring about conditions for erring deeds that destroy the Dharma. That is why, O Bhagavat, we entreat you to explain it to us and remove our doubts. The Buddha answers in the most famous proclamation of Docetism in Buddhist literature that although it is indeed widely believed that he left the palace of the Shakyas and achieved highest enlightenment near the city of Gaya, in fact, many billions of kalpas have passed since he attained Buddhahood. We should probably pause for a moment to consider this difficult term, kalpa. Typically translated as aeon, it is a measurement of time that cannot be measured by any standard unit. One must imagine instead a great stone cube, a yojana, or some 5 miles, in height, breadth, and depth. Imagine again that once every century, someone were to wipe that great stone cube with a piece of soft Benares silk. The amount of time it would take to thus wear away that stone cube is 1 kalpa. And this is the shortest of the kalpas. A mahakalpa, or great kalpa, is 80 times longer. The Buddha was enlightened an immeasurable number of kalpas ago. More important for our purposes, however, is not when the Buddha was enlightened, but when he will pass into nirvana. Later, in the 16th chapter of the Lotus, the Buddha proclaims, "My lifespan is immeasurable and incalculable. I abide forever without entering parinirvana." Instead, the Buddha only pretends to enter parinirvana in order that his less intelligent disciples not become indolent, thinking that the Buddha is always available to teach them the Dharma. And indeed, in the next chapter of the text, perhaps with those disciples in mind, the Buddha repeatedly extols the merits of, quote, "those who preserve and recite this Lotus Sutra and explain it to others, who copy it or move others to copy it, and who pay homage to it, and who do so, quote, after the Buddha's parinirvana." we find similar statements in other Mahayana sutras. I will mention only one more. At the beginning of the Sukhavati Vyuha, the most famous of the so-called Pure Land Sutras, the Buddha explains to Ananda, if the Tathagata so wished, Ananda, he could live for a whole kalpa on one bowl of alms offerings, or for 100 kalpas, for 1,000, for 100,000, and so on, up to 100,000 million trillion kalpas, or even beyond this. And still, the Tathagata's sense faculties would not perish, the color of his countenance would not change, nor would the color of his skin fade. And why is this? Because, Ananda, the Tathagata's perfection depends only on the power of his unceasing concentration. But these passages are from the Mahayana Sutras, known for their Baroque descriptions and exuberant, even psychedelic imagery, where everything is multiplied, often tediously multiplied, beyond the realm of comprehension. Why would we be surprised, or even find it particularly interesting, that in the Sukhavati Vyuha, the Buddha talks on and on about how long he can live, when he's about to extol the virtues of another Buddha, one named Amitayus, infinite lifespan. The Mahayana Sutras, with their proclamation of the immortality of the Buddha, were of course composed long after the Buddha's death. In the 19th century, they were regarded by scholars with a certain suspicion as appeals to the masses, as texts that clearly show the influence of Hindu theism, as if anything could be worse. This was followed by a long period of scholarly exuberance for the Mahayana, and especially for its philosophical systems. More recently, the Mahayana, especially in India, has again come to be regarded with a certain caution, as it has become clear that throughout the long history of Buddhism in India, the Mahayana remained a minority movement, with the Mahayana Sutra regarded by most as spurious. The sheer bulk of the Mahayana Sutras may indeed be less a sign of competent control and more a sign of a rather overwrought overcompensation. There persists today an interest in returning to what might be called the Buddhism of the Buddha, even if that's an impossible quest. That is, to understand the world of Subhuti, of Mahakashyapa, of Mahamodgalyayana, the great disciples of the Buddha. These figures are mocked, they are parodied, they are appropriated in the Mahayana Sutras, but in some cases, as they are turned into characters of comedy, the script that they read expresses our own attitudes with an uncanny accuracy, as again in the Lotus, where the great monks, the distinguished old men, awaiting their nirvana without remainder, are told that they must now embark on the Bodhisattva path. They reply to the Buddha, "It has been a long time since the Bhagavat taught the Dharma in the past. Now we sit with weary bodies and contemplate emptiness, signlessness, and wishlessness. Neither the Bodhisattva teaching, nor the carefree sporting with transcendent powers, nor the pure Buddha worlds, nor helping sentient beings attain enlightenment produce any eager desire in us. So let us then dispense with this carefree sporting with transcendent powers for the moment at least, and try to get back to the Buddha, or at least gain some sense of what immortality might have meant in the early community." This is what I have heard. One day, the Bhagavat was at Vaishali on the edge of the Markarada pond in a hall called Kutagara. So the Bhagavat, having dressed before noon, after having taken his robe and his bowl, entered Vaishali in order to collect alms, and after having gone through the city for this purpose, he took his repast. When he had eaten, having gathered his bowl and his robe, he went to the place where the Chapala Chaita stood, and having arrived there, he sought the trunk of a tree and sat nearby to pass the day. Here he addressed the respectable Ananda in this way: "Beautiful, O Ananda, is the city of Vaishali, the land of the Vrijis. Beautiful is the Chaita Chapala, that of the 7 mango trees, that of the many boys, the fig tree of Gautama, the grove of the Chalas, the place where one lays down his burden, the Chaita where the Mullas arrange their hair. Varied is Jambudvipa, life is pleasant in it for men. O Ananda, the being, whoever he is, who has searched for, understood, and disseminated the 4 principles of supernatural power, can live, if so requested, either for a full kalpa or until the end of the kalpa. Now, Ananda, the four principles of supernatural power belong to the Tathagata. The four principles of supernatural power, O Ananda, have been searched for, understood, and disseminated by the Tathagata, so he can live, if so requested, either for a full kalpa or until the end of the kalpa. This said, the respectable Ananda remained silent. 2 times and 3 times the Bhagavat addressed the respectable Ananda in this way. Then the Bhagavat addressed the respectable Ananda in this way. Go, O Ananda, seek the trunk of another tree to sit under. It is too confined here for us to remain together. Yes, Venerable Lord, replied the respectable Ananda to the Bhagavat, and seeking the trunk of another tree, he sat down to spend the day. However, Mara, the sinner, went to the place where the Bhagavat was, and having reached it, he spoke to him in these terms. May the Bhagavat enter into complete annihilation. For the Sugata, the time for complete annihilation has come. But why, O sinner, do you say, may the Bhagavat enter into complete annihilation? For the Sugata, the time of complete annihilation has come. This is, O Blessed One, the very time fixed by the Bhagavat, while in Uruvilva, on the bank of the river Naranjara, seated under the Bodhi tree, at the moment when he had just reached the state of perfect Buddha. As for me, I went to that place where the Buddha was, and having arrived, I spoke to him in this way, may the Bhagavat enter into complete annihilation, for the Sugata, the time of complete annihilation has come. But the Bhagavat responded, Sinner, I will not enter into complete annihilation as long as my listeners are not instructed, wise, disciplined, skillful, as long as they do not know how to reduce to the Dharma all the adversaries who rise against them, as long as they are not able to have all their reasonings adopted by others, as long as the monks and the devotees of both sexes do not fulfill the precepts of my Dharma by propagating it, by having it accepted by many people, by disseminating it everywhere until its precepts have been explained completely to gods and men. But today, said Mara, O respectable one, the listeners of the Bhagavat are instructed, wise, disciplined, skillful. They know how to reduce to the Dharma all the adversaries who rise up against them. They are able to have all their reasonings adopted by others. The monks and the devotees of the 2 sexes do fulfill the precepts of the Dharma, which has been propagated, accepted by many people, disseminated everywhere until its precepts are explained completely to gods and men. This is why I say, may the Bhagavat now enter into complete annihilation, for the Sugata, the moment of complete annihilation, has come. Do not be hasty, O sinner. You do not have a long time to wait now. In 3 months, this very year, there will be the annihilation of the Tathagata into the element of nirvana, where nothing that constitutes existence remains. Then Mara, the sinner, had this thought. He thus will enter into complete annihilation, the Shramana Gautama. And having learned that, content, satisfied, joyous, enraptured, filled with pleasure and satisfaction, Mara disappeared on that very spot. Then the Bhagavat had this reflection. Why would I not enter into a meditation such that by applying my mind to it, after having mastered the elements of my life, I renounce my existence? Then the Bhagavat entered into a meditation such that by applying his mind, after having mastered the elements of his life, he abandoned existence. He'd scarcely mastered the elements of his life when a great trembling of the earth was felt. Meteors fell from the sky. The horizon seemed to be on fire. The kettle drums of the devas resounded through the air. He scarcely renounced existence when 6 prodigies appeared among the devas, kamavacharas. The flower trees, the diamond trees, the ornament trees were broken. The 1,000 palaces of the gods were shaken. The peaks of Meru fell in ruins. The musical instruments of the devatas were struck and made sounds. Then the Bhagavat, having emerged from this meditation, pronounced at this moment the following stanza. The recluse has renounced existence, which is similar to and different from the elements of which life is composed. Focused in mind, meditative, like a bird born from an egg, he has broken his shell. Then the respectable Ananda, having emerged from his deep meditation at nightfall, went to the place where the Bhagavat was, and having reached it, after having saluted the feet of the Bhagavat by touching them with his head, he stood close to him. There, standing, the respectable Ananda spoke to the Buddha in this way: "What is the cause, O Lord? What is the reason for this great trembling of the earth?" There are 8 causes, O Ananda, and I'm only going to tell you 2. So, there are 8 causes, O Ananda, for a great trembling of the earth. And what are these 8 causes? The great earth, O Ananda, rests on water. The water rests on wind. The wind on ether. When, O Ananda, it happens that opposing winds blow over the ether, they stir the waters. The rolling waters make the earth move. This, O Ananda, is the first cause, the first reason for a great trembling of the earth. Still one more thing, Ananda. At the time when the Tathagata, having gained mastery over the elements of his life, renounces existence, then at this very moment there is a great trembling of the earth. Meteors fall from the sky. The horizon appears to be on fire. The kettle drums of the devas ring in the air, and this entire world is illuminated by a noble splendor. And the beings who live beyond the boundaries of this world say to themselves, "Behold, there are other beings among us." This, O Ananda, is the 7th cause, the 7th reason for a great trembling of the earth. And still one more thing, O Ananda, the moment is not so distant when the complete annihilation of the Tathagata into nirvana will occur, when nothing remains of that which constitutes existence. Thus, at such a moment, there is a great trembling of the earth. The meteors fall from the sky. The horizon appears to be on fire. The kettle drums of the devas ring in the air, and this entire world is illuminated by a noble splendor. And the beings who live beyond the boundaries of this world say to themselves, "Ah, behold, the other beings born among us." This, Ananda, is the 8th cause, the 8th reason for a trembling of the earth. Then the respectable Ananda spoke to the Buddha in this way: "If I understand well, O Lord, the meaning of the language of the Bhagavat, in this very place, the Bhagavat, after having gained mastery of the elements of his life, has renounced existence." The Bhagavat said, "This is so, Ananda, this is just so. Now, O Ananda, the Bhagavat, after having gained mastery of the elements of existence, has renounced existence. But I've heard from the lips of the Bhagavat while in his presence. I've gathered from his lips these words: the being, whoever he may be, who has searched for, understood, disseminated the 4 principles of supernatural power, can live, if so requested, either for an entire kalpa or until the end of the kalpa. The 4 principles of supernatural power, O Venerable One, have been searched for, understood, disseminated by the Bhagavat. The Tathagata can live, if so requested, for either an entire kalpa or until the end of the kalpa. Therefore, may the Bhagavat consent to remain during this kalpa. May the Sugata remain until the end of the kalpa. It is a mistake on your part, O Ananda. It is an evil deed that at the moment when the noble manifestation of the thought of the Tathagata was produced, as many as 3 times, you could not understand the purpose of it, and you must have been guided by Mara the sinner. This account occurs with certain variations in a number of texts, most famously in the Pali and Sanskrit versions of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. The version I've read from this evening appears in the Mandatri Sutra of the Divyavadana. It is a fascinating account raising a host of issues about the immortality of the Buddha. During his final rains retreat, the Buddha becomes gravely ill, near death, and describes his body as being like an old cart held together by straps. He only finds relief from his physical pain when he practices meditation. Not wanting to die without assembling the community of monks one last time, he seems to extend his lifespan through a sheer act of will. Feeling somewhat better, he decides to spend an afternoon relaxing in the forest and asks Ananda, his cousin and personal attendant, to accompany him. It is while they are sitting together under a tree that the Buddha makes an offhand remark that contains a remarkable claim, an extraordinary claim, that should he so desire, should he be so requested, he could extend his life for a kalpa or until the end of a kalpa. Given what we've understood the term kalpa to mean, the Buddha seems to be saying, roughly speaking, that were we merely asked to do so, he could live forever. How can we understand this statement from the person who said that all existence is marked by suffering, impermanence, and no self? How can the Buddha say that he can live forever and just 3 months hence, as he lies down on his right side with his head toward the north, announce to his assembled followers, all conditioned things have a nature of disintegration? From one perspective, this intimation of immortality is yet a further sign of the Buddha's remarkable power. What is perhaps more interesting is the fact that Ananda does not ask him to exercise it. 45 years earlier, the recently awakened Buddha had surveyed the world and concluded that there was no one in the world capable of understanding what he had understood, and thus it was futile for him to attempt to teach the Dharma to others. But the god Brahma famously descended from his heaven and implored the Buddha not to abandon the world, and the Buddha acceded to his request. Thus, when Mata appears shortly thereafter to ask the Buddha to enter nirvana immediately, the Buddha refuses, saying that he will do so only after he is taught what there is to teach. Now, 45 years later, he has done what is to be done. Yet, he broadly hints 3 times that he can live forever if only Ananda will ask him to. But Ananda does not ask, and this time Brahma does not descend from heaven. It becomes a missed opportunity, a moment of loss. For Buddhas appear but rarely in this world, and all of us must long lament our sad fate that our roots of virtue were insufficient to bring us into the circle of the Buddha's own disciples, disciples who entered the stream to nirvana by simply hearing him speak. We can only wonder how things might have been different if the Buddha were alive today and would live long into the future. And so Ananda, the most kind-hearted but not the most intelligent of monks, bears the blame for not taking the hint the first time, the second time, the third time. After the Buddha's passing, Ananda would be placed on trial, and this would be one of the crimes with which he was charged, along with encouraging the Buddha to ordain women, along with allowing the tears of women to stain the feet of the Buddha's corpse, along with allowing women to see the Buddha's famous retractable penis after he died, along with forgetting to ask the Buddha which minor rules of the monastic code might be ignored after his death. Ananda's defense to this first charge is that his mind was distracted by Mata. For when Ananda fails to ask, Mata appears immediately to remind the Buddha of what he'd promised decades ago, and to remind him that indeed his work is done. The Buddha seems to concede the point, for he promises Mata that he will enter nirvana in 3 months' time. The Buddha then relinquishes his life force, causing the earth to tremble. Ananda is aroused from his deep meditation and asks the Buddha to explain why the earth has quaked. The Buddha rather tediously provides one of those lists so common in Buddhism, this time the 8 reasons for an earthquake. The first is more or less natural. The second can be caused by any yogin or deity with a certain modicum of power. But the last 6 are all associated with the life of the Buddha. The earth quakes when he enters his mother's womb. The earth quakes when he is born. The earth quakes when he achieves enlightenment. The earth quakes when he first turns the wheel of the Dharma. And ominously, the earth quakes when he relinquishes his life force. Last of all, the earth quakes when he enters final nirvana. This enumeration of 8 causes even Ananda to infer that the earth has just trembled for the 7th of the 8 reasons, and he recalls only then that the Buddha has told him that if but asked, the Buddha can live until the end of the kalpa. And so he asks, but the Buddha, rather mercilessly, tells him that he's missed his chance. And in other accounts, he rubs it in by listing 15 other occasions when Ananda had not taken the very same hint. 3 months later, the Buddha dies, or in the language of the scholastics, achieves the nirvana without remainder. This is only the second of 3 nirvanas. The third is called the nirvana of the relics, which will occur in a far distant time, but long before the end of the kalpa. This will be the time when all trace of the teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha will have utterly disappeared. There will be no monks. There will be no nuns. There will be no monasteries or temples or pagodas. There will be no books about Buddhism in the library. In our terms, it will be the time when one does a Google search for the word Buddha, only to read, "Your search Buddha, return no results." Did you mean buddy? Then the relics will burst out of their reliquaries and assemble one last time beneath the Bodhi tree before being incinerated. And so the Buddha must die because he has taught what is to be taught. From the point of his death, from the time of his death, his teaching, like all conditioned things, will slowly decay until finally no trace of it at all will remain. It's only then that Maitreya, now waiting so patiently in the Tushita heaven, will appear. The Buddha must die so that the Buddha, the next Buddha, can be born. And he will teach just what the last Buddha taught. For whether Tathagatas arise, O monks, or whether Tathagatas do not arise, it remains a fact and the fixed and necessary constitution of being that all its constituents are transitory. It is only impermanence that is permanent. It is only mortality that is immortal, as one Buddha after another will come to remind us again and again into the infinite future. And yet, the Buddha would still be with us if Ananda had only asked. It seems that in Buddhism, the immortality of the Buddha must remain at the level of illusion, that which appears to be present or perhaps possible, but in fact is not. And if we read the commentaries, as of course we must, perhaps the immortality of the Buddha is not even a missed opportunity or an illusion, but merely a mistake. For when we consult the most important of all the commentators on the Pali Canon, we find that the great 5th century monk Buddhaghosa himself seems to confirm the stereotype of the Theravada as a tradition of austere rationality by taking the term kalpa not to mean mahakalpa, that impossibly long length of time, but instead an ayukalpa, a term that means a normal lifespan, measured by the Buddha in another context as a mere 100 years. This would seem to mean that if Ananda had only asked, the Buddha could have expended his life for another few years. So much for immortality. In closing, I'd like to briefly consider another form of immortality, but on a somewhat less grand scale. The life of the Buddha has been recounted in European languages since at least the 13th century, when Marco Polo, describing his visit to Sri Lanka as he sailed back home to Italy, told with surprising accuracy of the life of Sagamoni Borkhan. The discovery of Sanskrit by European scholars several centuries later vastly expanded the base of knowledge. The epical event occurred in 1844 when Eugène Burnouf, holder of the chair of Sanskrit at the Collège de France, published his massive introduction to the history of Indian Buddhism. And so Buddhist studies was born. We've learned much more since then, but I would hesitate to necessarily call this progress. All the passages that I've read to you this evening had been translated by Burnouf in 1844, 50 years before the bequest for the Ingersoll lecture, 60 years before Dr. Sturgis mentioned Buddhism in his Ingersoll lecture. Burnouf published his translations when Reverend Ingersoll himself had not returned to Cambridge but was still a pastor in Burlington, Vermont. So in tribute to Burnouf and in a vain attempt to ensure his immortality as well as that of the Buddha, every passage I've read tonight from a Buddhist text has been translated from Burnouf's 1844 French. The graduate students in the audience will have noted his rare error on the 6 perfections. Perhaps translation then is the mode of ensuring immortality, albeit an immortality that is predicated on the persistence of a book. But if a book lies unread in the crypt of the library, as Bernouf's has for so long, is the book Mortal or Immortal. Translation seems to be a way of breathing life, but even a translation becomes just a book in the stacks, a doppelganger cataloged and shelved next to its original. Perhaps there also must be that which seems so much more ephemeral than the book. Perhaps there must also be speech. This year marks my 25th year in the college classroom, and as I began teaching Intro to Buddhism in Ann Arbor last month, I thought about how many times I have told the story of the life of the Buddha. And I thought about how many times I will tell it in the future. It occurred to me that even if he did not extend his lifespan to the end of the Kalpa, the Buddha has achieved a different kind of immortality, a different kind of timelessness since he passed into nirvana, one unimagined even by the most grandiose of his commentators and chroniclers. For every fall and every spring, in thousands of classrooms across North America, a continent that does not appear among the islands that surround Mount Meru, the Buddha's name is spoken and his story is told. A week of lectures, sometimes two, is reserved for him each season. We offer this to him year after year, not simply because of who he was and what he taught over 2,500 years ago, both of which remain active topics for our investigation, but because of a more recent history that must also be told. In the Palazzo Doria Pamphilj in Rome, there is an early painting by Caravaggio, circa 1595, entitled Rest on the Flight into Egypt. On the right side of the painting, the Madonna and Christ child sit sleeping. In the center of the painting, with his back turned to the viewer, stands a young angel playing a violin. On the left side sits Joseph, transfixed by the angel's music. But as in so many of Caravaggio's paintings, there is something unexpected. For in his hands, Joseph holds up the musical score for the angel to read. Caravaggio did not paint random notes on the score that Joseph holds, but instead copied a Flemish motet to the Virgin Mary. The lyrics are from the Song of Songs. The painting seems to suggest that in order to ensure immortality, even of the divine, it is we who must provide the words and the music. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
So, Professor Lopez is open to.
Yes, Don.
A couple of questions and observations. I wonder if you see texts, and we could maybe say any text, as sites of contestation, that in the Buddhist tradition, perhaps that which is most contested is, in fact, the issue of the nature of the Buddha.
No, the nature of the Buddha.
Yeah, is the nature of the Buddha.
Right.
And so part of that contestation then is the Buddha's immortality. This, though, devolves back to the question, well, really, what is the nature of the Buddha? What is the nature of mortality as well as immortality? Bringing in the question of the Dharma, then, an important part of this issue, then, is what is contested as in part the relationship between the Dharma and the Buddha. Mm-hmm. I guess maybe let me make a couple of other observations. Sure. And get it all out at once. That which is part of the nature of the Buddha in many of these texts, particularly the one we cite, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, are the Buddha's remains, the relics.
Right.
One could argue that, in a sense, for the cult of relics to flourish, the Buddha, as a mortal being, had to pass away. Right. And then as you end your very moving and interesting talk, for which I'm very grateful, in bringing it back to the present and telling the story of the Buddha, in a sense, of course, that's the way the Buddha has been made immortal from time immemorial. So the Buddha travels to northern Thailand or wherever he travels, Buddha's immortality is the Buddha's presence, being made present. Now, if you can make sense out of any of that.
All I can say is I agree completely, and this whole question of relics and which comes up again in Lotus is of course a huge topic, and I can tell you when Don Square has just written a fantastic book on the topic of the consecration of Buddha images, which has to do with all of this and Buddha's persistence through time. Of course, the problem that we get in the Lotus is, of course, the Buddha is commenting upon his own earlier teachings, and seems to be saying, well, when I said that I could live forever, I really meant it. He doesn't say that in those many words. There's not a reference back to Mahapada Nirvana. But there is certainly the case, the sense that the Buddha, in some sense, does have to die in order for Maitreya to come. And so the whole kind of expectation, the whole millennial element of the tradition is predicated on the absence of the previous Buddha, and that comes up over and over again. And it's the fact that so many of the early biographies of the Buddha talking about the previous Buddha sort of gives this same kind of continuation over this strange cosmic cycle, a very interesting sort of tone. But then you're quite right that within that there is this stuff, these pieces of bone and these teeth and these fingernails, which get enshrined in 84,000 stupas, if we're to believe what Ashoka was supposed to have done. And that provides a kind of sanctification of the landscape that's going to persist into the very far distant future. But even that has to disappear in order for Maitreya to come. So there's a kind of immortality of the Buddha in a certain sense, but that can only happen with individual Buddhas coming and going and dying and being born.
Tom, would you say a word about the relation, about your thoughts about the whole concept of bodhisattva in relation to this continuum of, mortality or immortality, if you will?
Oh, now that's... Bodhisattvas, again, have set out on this very, very long path, which also consumes many kalpas. I mean, I was lecturing about this a couple of years ago and had a Korean monk in my class at Michigan. And I always allow the students to, sometimes in a big class, they don't like to raise their hand and ask a question, so I have them just send an index card at the end of the lecture. And so I said something about the Buddha could have lived forever if he wanted to. And the monk sent me a note. He said, I don't think he said he could live forever. He said he could live till the end of the kalpa. And so there is this length of time which seems so utterly unfathomable to us is actually a measure of time which is multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And they say that in certain Mahayana sutras that a bodhisattva from the time that he takes the vow to achieve Buddhahood may become a Buddha in the period of 3 incalculable periods of aeons at the shortest. That's the shortest. And so we're just sort of faced with this kind of cosmic cycle, which is, at least to me, it is baffling and incomprehensible, but it doesn't seem to have been to the authors of these texts, who really seem to be concerned about, was it 3 or 2 incalculable numbers of eons?
Well, I was thinking, what about the issue of volition involved?
Yeah.
Choosing to, in fact, put off nirvana for the sake of all being.
Yeah, well, that's...
this volition is a very interesting thing with relation to immortality.
Well, that volition is certainly present throughout the tradition in the story of Sumedha, the person the yogin who became took the bodhisattva vow and became Shakyamuni Buddha. The Buddha Dipankara had arrived on the scene, and Sumedha was a yogin, one of these long-locked guys, and there was a mud puddle. And he didn't want the Buddha to sully his feet in the mud, so he just lay face down and sort of spread out his long sort of dreadlocks to make a mat in the mud. And the text says that as he was lying face down in the mud, he had the thought, if I wanted to, I could listen to the teachings of this Buddha Dipankara and I could become an arhat in this very lifetime. But I'm not going to do it. I'm deciding now not to listen to his teachings, that is, to intentionally not become the disciple of this rare being in the universe, so that I may become that being kalpas in the future. And at that moment, of course, Dipankara comes and sees this yogin face down in the mud and makes the prediction that this will become the Gautama Buddha in eons in the far future. But the intention, the wish, the bodhicitta, this remains a constant throughout, whether we're talking about Theravada or Mahayana. This is central. Yeah.
Professor Lopez, at a few points in your talk, you were playing off of a distinction between the Buddha's potential immortality, in his lifetime as Shakyamuni, versus his parinirvana.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if you could comment a little bit about nirvana, because then in other texts, even in places in the Pali Canon, it's understood not so much in opposition to immortality, but as immortality, as the deathless, or through some kind of synonym. So how about, do you have any comments about nirvana itself as immortality?
Oh,
and not to mention the whole
yes.
Mahayana, that once we have Nirvana, we have the Prayas and all that.
If we're going to look at nirvana technically in terms of the five skandhas, in terms of mind and body, we know that it is the cessation of mind and body. That is, consciousness and form do not persist in nirvana, in parinirvana. And if that's the case, then nirvana is necessarily inconceivable to us, right? Though we cannot conceive of a state without consciousness, without form. So it's deathless in the sense that it's birthless. It's deathless in the sense that there's no more rebirth there. And obviously people like Renouf, and you've read the recent work which has sort of talked about the way that French philosophers over the 19th century were sort of fixated on this idea of annihilation. That's the way they saw it. But it is, as you say, described in all sorts of positive terms. This is something we always are struggling with, and I don't have a good answer to that one, I'm sorry to say. Yes?
To actually add on and slightly contextualize that question, there are many terms in Pali that would seem to render the notion of immortality a bit ambiguous. There are terms like akalika. How would you translate that?
What is it in Tibetan?
In Tibetan?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm not a Pali scholar. You can ask Professor Swear.
Is the negative.
Yeah, I knew that
part
much, yeah.
Pali of time.
Yeah, right.
Timelessness.
Mm-hmm.
But the Buddha is in that sutta is referring to the Dhamma and referring to himself in the sense of somehow it is, and he's talking to Mara, incidentally again. But one can't translate that as immortality.
And the Dharma is also going to disappear, right? So it's not timeless.
Well, it's certainly not enduring in time, but it has some other quality. So there are a lot of terms that could function to us maybe a salient of something like immortality, but they seem to have a welter of terms that could make more precise maybe some of the confusions with the English. That I was wondering if the fact that he even sometimes the Buddha is given to speak of life as we know it now, when he's talking about the achievements of monks as they're living, in very ambiguous terms, the way he would talk about or discourage talk about nirvana. So it would seem sometimes a big metaphysical postulate like nirvana is troublesome. But sometimes in the Pali Sutras, even simple things like his status in life is troublesome. The status of a monk is troublesome. Yeah. Would that soften the problem or render it more general?
It seems more general to me, but I haven't pursued those issues too much. Yes, Don?
I mean, this is not exactly a cop-out, but I wonder if, again, if you look at texts as sites of contestation, that you've got debates going on in these texts, and then if you stack up texts that some of which you know are earlier and some of which you know are later, particularly with the Maitreya texts that come in at some sort of apocalyptic, at least in the Pali tradition, these apocalyptic texts are somewhat of a later genre or a later vintage. So, as I say, it's not a way really of answering your question, other than to providing a perspective on it, which is sort of to embrace diversity, to embrace disagreement. I think we so often tend to reify and give a kind of singular position to things. But I don't know if that's useful or not.
No, it helps think about
Could I raise
another
question with you, John? I wonder if your sort of reference to Dipankara and Sumedha and the whole kind of Vedanta tradition, in the Pali tradition, the Mahapadana, which is part of this Buddhological, the Buddhas of this kalpa, that this may offer a different kind of perspective on the notion of Buddha as immortal in the sense of timeless, so that we have great kalpas, we have these great periods of time, and they're, as it were, populated with Buddha. So Buddha is present, and the sort of multiplication of that view of the Buddha being in one kalpa, then in another kalpa where we have different names, and yet the pattern is the same. So while there appears to be difference, at the same time it is Buddha. So there's a kind of immortality in terms of universalizing the pattern. Would that be? I mean, maybe that's so far afield from the question of immortality that it doesn't really enter into the calculus. But.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, once we get into the Mahayana and the Lotus, where there are Buddhas in all universes and multiple universes, and just billions of Buddhas appearing on the scene in every chapter, that question is not as difficult about the absence of the Buddha, because there's always a Buddha someplace. And in fact, the Buddha says in the 16th chapter of the Lotus that he had taught Dipankara himself, and so there's a kind of one-upsmanship, obviously, of the authors of the Lotus trying to get back before the kind of normative tradition in terms of time, and this whole question of immortality in a certain sense. But there's also the sense that Buddhas do differ a little bit, as you know, and for example, we know that Maitreya is going to be much taller than Shakyamuni Buddha, right? There's the story of Mahakashyapa is now inside a mountain somewhere holding Shakyamuni's robe and bowl to present to Maitreya, and when he presents it to Maitreya, it says that Maitreya will take the Buddha's robe and simply place it on his tip of his pinky, and say, boy, he was a very little Buddha, wasn't he? So, at least the deeds that they do, the amount of time they spend in asceticism, the number of sons they have, all those things do vary. And so it's an interesting sort of take on the precise identical deeds that they do, and then the way that they vary. And so, yeah.
I mean, just to follow this train of thought that we're getting into, one of the things about the repeating Buddhas, who are very similar to each other, is that that's parallel to a much more basic metaphysics of momentariness in Buddhist ontological analyses of anything. The explanation of how things continue without being permanent is that they're constantly replicating themselves, but not precisely exactly the same, and that there is a moment of death and then quick self-reproduction. The one thing I would also suggest, when you're thinking more broadly about Buddhism and this notion of impermanence and definite death, just a very general kind of observation, is to think how radical a position it is for this sort of major sort of religious revelation to be basically saying, this extremely sort of practical, humanistic sort of idea that you just have to die and there's death and that's the end. And how difficult it is to sustain such a position as this huge religion develops. And so you get all kinds of devices, and you see the Buddhist tradition is fighting against it, and yet at the same time capitulating in a very complex tension. What's amazing is that the theme of sort of impermanence and inevitable death remains as this major leitmotif in Buddhism, despite despite all odds, and how improbable it is to have religion that talks about, well, it's all over and that's it.
So you're one of the people who thinks that Hindu theism crept in?
Exactly, and that was a painting.
Yes.
I have a question about the Buddha Dosa comment, which has struck me, the idea that a kalpa is really the length of a life. Now, I was wondering if in the Tibetan tradition you knew of any debates about that point, whether anyone explicitly raised as an objection, well, the Buddha, a kalpa could just be a life, or the lifespan of a Buddha could just be 100 years, and then someone responds in some way.
No, that's never mentioned in the Tibetan tradition, and I believe that Johnny had an article on this issue, and he is in fact feels that Buddha Ghosa's position here is a little bit shaky. But we do have this term kalpa, which seems to mean, whatever the length of,
Because even in the Indian tradition, the only place I see this tension played out is in sort of literary context, narrative context. And I've always been puzzled as to why that is, because there's plenty of opportunities in philosophical texts to sort of begin to pursue this. And I'm wondering if I suspect I'm wondering why you think in philosophical texts an issue that could be raised is not, and is really only adequately answered or answered at all in a different genre altogether, or different genres. If we take, say, Abhidhanas and Apadanas and then sutras in different genres, what do you think that's really all about?
And what issue are you talking about?
The issue of raising the question of the Buddha's life being, say, 100 years, that notion of limitedness, is not explicitly discussed in Buddhist texts, right? In India, none that I know of. It's only discussed in a way, as you have, through narratives and sutra literature. And I'm wondering what that fact tells us.
Yeah. I'm trying to think where it actually is discussed, and I think it is discussed, for example, you could probably find something in the commentaries to the Abhismayalankara in the 9th chapter, just talking about the Dharmakaya. And then when they talk about Sambhogakaya, and they do say that Sambhogakaya is immortal. It teaches the Mahayana permanently in Akanishta, heaven. But once you make the historical Buddha Nirmanakaya, then it's just a show anyway, and the amount of time that he appears to persist in this earth is just a matter of upaya. And so it doesn't seem that question would be of particular interest. Once you have a Trikaya theory, the lifespan of Nirmanakaya becomes almost moot.
But it gets picked up in such a big way in other genres. In a way, that answer is only, as Janet was suggesting, only partially satisfying this problem. And it's just always struck me as to this, what's always struck me as a big difference between the Kaya theory as a kind of response, and in many ways, the more satisfying way of dealing with the issue in literature. I'm puzzled.
Yeah, it's something to continue thinking about. Yeah.
In your homage to the Buddha's immortality at the end, you seem to locate the present immortality of Buddha in academic institutions, in classrooms, lectures. And I'm wondering if that's because that's where we find ourselves right now, or whether you're making a subtle point about the role of academics in the study of Buddhism, the study of Buddha's life, and why, for example, you didn't include practitioners or people for art forms and so forth. And so, I'm specifically curious about your subtle also critique of the notion of progress in Buddhist studies in general. So I'm wondering if you could maybe clarify those hidden plans.
I always think of a named lecture as a kind of evocation or even a sermon, and therefore, and generally reluctant to engage in any detailed commentary on what I've just said. But the fact that you found something subtle in it leads me to at least try to. My allusion at the end of the classroom was really to talk about the development of Buddhist studies as a discipline, and the ways in which the Buddha, above other Asian figures, has somehow become emblematic of something in our academic world. And in fact, tracing the way in which the Buddha was transformed from a stone idol into a man of flesh and blood. As you know, in the prior to the 19th century, Europeans tended to divide the nations of the world, not so much religion, but nations, into four, and there were the Christians and Jews and Muslims and the idolaters. And in a certain sense, the Buddha was just another one of those idols in that kind of undifferentiated category. And through an interesting historical process, really beginning only in the 1790s, not that long ago, he and his tradition were somehow pulled out from that category of pagan idolatry and made into something that we call Buddhism, and that has become a staple of our curriculum. there are a host of reasons for that. That's a whole other lecture, or series of lectures, but that was my allusion to the classroom. In terms of progress, there's a Tibetan practice of when something important needs to happen or something important is not happening, the monks will take the Gangdra and the Dengdra take the cannon out and they'll walk it around the village or the field, and then they'll go back into the temple and open up the books and read the whole thing aloud. So there'll be 500 monks who each have a volume and they're just reading at the top of their lungs. They have no idea what they're reading. It's just an utter cacophony of sound. And there's a famous story of a monk who was chastised for actually reading what everybody had in front of him, so he was getting interested in what he had beforehand. So there is this whole power of sound and repetition, and my evocation of Berluf here is to try to get us to think about the fact that somebody who never left his study in Paris and just got a big pile of manuscripts from Brian Hodgson, 98 of those, just read them, and then he wrote a book about it. And when you go back and read what he said, we haven't come very far since then. Despite all our study with Tibetan lamas and all of our contact with, and so there's a strange kind of celebration of Orientalism that we find in reading the work of these scholars. And we've kind of forgotten that in the whole critique, which Janet seems to be blaming me for. So I'd like to try to rehabilitate myself as an Orientalist in that respect. So.
Thank you all very much for attending. We have a reception now, which is right across the street.
No, I think it's just down in the brown room.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's right in the brown room in just down the hall that way. So please all come in and raise a drink, and you'll have a chance to speak with Professor Lopez separately as well. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.